let's talk about a man known as the God Emperor of mankind. The God Emperor is one of, if not the most powerful being in the Warhammer 40k universe. In addition to being the most powerful human psychic ever born, he's also a perpetual, which is a kind of mutant human that can never die of old age and can regenerate from pretty much any wound. This regenerative ability is so strong, in fact, that one of his children, who's also a perpetual, was apparently able to regenerate from complete molecular disintegration. So, it's estimated that he was born sometime around 8000 BC, and for a long, long time he helped guide humanity from the shadows, not really taking an active role and being largely unknown to the public. By the 29th century, interstellar travel had been possible for a while, and humans had spread throughout the galaxy, settling on various planets. But, for reasons that we'll get to later, eventually something disastrous happened, and it made interstellar travel completely impossible and sent humanity back to the Dark Ages. So now Earth was basically a Mad Max hellscape full of techno-barbarians, and the Emperor decided that he was going to unite humanity under his rule, whether they liked it or not. So he waged a series of wars across Earth, or Terra, called the Unification Wars. He was able to assure that he would win these wars by creating the first kind of genetically enhanced super soldier of their kind called the Thunder Warriors, which would later be known as a kind of early attempt at a space marine. Today we're going to talk about the first genetically enhanced super soldiers created by the Emperor of mankind that can therefore kind of be considered like an early attempt at a space marine. During the Age of Strife, Terra was basically nothing more than a wasteland full of techno-barbarians like this. Mechanically augmented, brutal warriors that basically made everything into a Mad Max hellscape. The Emperor saw this and realized he would need to create soldiers that were faster and stronger than anyone had ever seen so that he could unite all of Terra under his rule. Enter the Thunder Warriors. Now they have kinds of mechanical and genetic enhancements that are considered relatively crude compared to the Space Marines that came after them, but despite all this, they're actually stronger, faster, and larger than Space Marines. And due to the fact that psychic entities and psychers were all over the place at this time, they also had a kind of psychic protection that hurt anyone that tried to psychically attack them. In fact, a Thunder Warrior was more than a match for a Space Marine, and they were even known to outperform the Emperor's own personal bodyguard, the Custodes. They also had this Mark I power armor, which would later be developed into the power armor that the Space Marines wear. Now, even though these augmentations had incredible results, they would almost inevitably lead to some kind of terrible complication mentally or physically in the host. They were also hyper-aggressive and could be very difficult to control sometimes, especially in the heat of battle, which made them pretty well suited to taking on all the techno-barbarians, but would be a problem in the long run. The Thunder Warriors were relatively short-lived because of their augmentations, but the Emperor would need soldiers that were brilliant and could live long enough to endure really lengthy space voyages. So even though the official story is that all of the Thunder Warriors died in the very last battle of the Unification Wars, in truth, the Emperor had all of them killed, down to the very last one by his Custodes. The Emperor had the fallen Thunder Warriors declared heroes, and none were the wiser. Today, we're going to talk about the Warp, which in the 40k universe is sort of like an alternate dimension made of psychic energy that most civilizations also use for faster-than-light travel. It's also known as the Immaterium or the Empyrean, and it's made up of the energy that comes from all of the emotions felt by living things throughout the galaxy. But since Warhammer 40k takes place in a year, 40,000, at that point things have gotten so bad pretty much everywhere that the Warp is full of demons because everyone feels terrible. The strongest entities that also rule legions and legions of demons are the 4 Chaos Gods above me. We'll talk about them in more detail in a later video, but their names are Khorne, Nurgle, Tzeentch, and Slaanesh. So most demons in the Warp belong to one of these 4 gods. The Warp is incredibly dangerous for a bunch of reasons, the main ones being that it's basically hell, and that if you go in unprotected, then it will twist your body and mind into something completely different. So, ships typically use things called Geller fields to protect them from the effects of the Warp while they travel through it, since time and space don't work the same there. Since the Warp is kind of like an ocean that's getting more and more churned up over time, sometimes specialized psychers are needed to navigate the Warp. For humans, that's usually these guys, astropaths. Without them, you're basically flying blind and you have no idea where you're going to end up when you exit the Warp. Now, something very important to note is that the Emperor, for whatever reason, felt that it would be best to keep all these demons and forces of chaos a secret from humanity. His line of thinking was that if you didn't know that the demons existed, then maybe you wouldn't be as susceptible to their influences. Whether that actually made anyone safer is very questionable, but that's a whole other video in itself. The Primarchs are the 20 genetically enhanced children of the Emperor of Mankind that were designed to lead his legions across the stars and unite humanity under his empire, the Imperium of Man. The Thunder Warriors were enough to help him conquer Terra, but now the Emperor of Mankind was setting out to unite innumerable planets throughout the galaxy. So, the Emperor decided to create legions of tight-knit, genetically enhanced soldiers using augmentations that were way more advanced than the Thunder Warriors. But each legion would need to be led by a general whose strength, wisdom, and charisma was second to only the Emperor's. But, to be honest, they kind of had to be way more than just generals in order to effectively lead these legions for the purposes of the Emperor's crusade. They would also need to be diplomats that could negotiate or convince anyone that was hesitant to join the Emperor, because the Emperor did prefer to unite everyone peacefully if possible. They also had to be statesmen that could effectively manage all the worlds they had already conquered on their crusade, and needless to say, they would need to be unbeatable warriors. Oddly enough, to make the Primarchs, the Emperor apparently made some deal with the Chaos Gods a long time ago before the Age of Strife. But with this knowledge and cutting-edge technology, he was able to create his 20 children from his own genome. Since the leader of each legion of Thunder Warriors was given the rank of Primarch, the Emperor also called his children the Primarchs. The Emperor made all kinds of modifications and stuff to each Primarch's DNA, and it made them perfectly embody a particular aspect of war. After he made the Primarchs, the Chaos Gods realized that the Emperor was actually going to be able to bring a lot of peace and happiness and prosperity to the universe if he succeeded, even if there wouldn't be so much of that along the way. So they did something very rare and very dangerous, and the 4 Chaos Gods actually put aside their rivalries and teamed up. They opened warp rifts in all their gestation capsules and spirited them away to random planets all over the galaxy, and they were lost to the Emperor for quite a while. At the end of my last video, I mentioned that the 20 Primarchs created by the Emperor of Mankind were teleported out of their gestation capsules across the galaxy to various planets. Eventually, the Emperor did find all 20 Primarchs on their respective planets, now fully grown, and took them back with him to be trained as the generals that he always intended them to be. But if you were particularly perceptive, you might have noticed that there are actually only 18 Primarchs above me, and only 18 Primarchs are ever shown. And that's because, for whatever reason, 2 legions, or their Primarchs, did something so terrible that the Emperor had them completely stricken from all records, and forbade anyone from ever speaking of them, even other Primarchs. And with that out of the way, I'm going to try to go over all 18 Primarchs as quickly as I can. Each of the 20 legions was given a number based on the order that they were created, so the Primarchs also have those numbers, and we're going to go in that order. The first Primarch is Lion L. Johnson, who grew up on the planet Caliban, which had dense jungles full of terrible beasts. He grew up surviving by himself in those woods as a wild man until he was eventually found by this nearby knight-like order of people. The second Primarch is one of the 2 lost Primarchs, so this is the third Primarch, Fulgrim. Fulgrim was practically obsessed with perfection, spiritually, physically, and mentally. He's pretty vain, and he demands perfection in all things. The fourth Primarch is the walking tank known as Perturabo. All these things attached to his head are data uplinks that essentially give him a heads-up display of all the information he would need right in the middle of combat. His legion specializes in breaking sieges, and he's added so many weapons and plating to his armor that it's compared to a tank pretty regularly. The fifth Primarch, Jaghatai Khan, is pretty reclusive even by the Primarch standards. The Primarch made his own decisions and would not be influenced by anyone, not even really the Emperor. He fought the Great Crusade like the Emperor wanted, but he did it for his reasons, not for the Emperor's. And also because he realized turning down the Emperor would have been a bad idea. We'll continue with Leman Russ in part 3. We're going to continue listing Primarchs where we left off at my last video, but before we do, we need to talk about how the Emperor can see into the future. And he didn't just see the future, he saw possible futures. So the Emperor could essentially choose a future and then try to direct things in that way. That's important because some of the Primarchs inherited bits of this power to varying degrees. The sixth Primarch is Leman Russ, also known as the Wolf King. The Emperor apparently used animal DNA when creating some of the Primarchs, and namely, wolf DNA when creating Leman Russ. He's known as one of the most skilled fighters in one-on-one combat, and he has a lot of wolf-like traits, physically and mentally. What's more, he and his entire legion have a Viking theme, so they're kind of like werewolf Vikings in space. The 7th Primarch is Rogal Dorn, who specializes in defense. He's one of the Primarchs that's most dedicated to the Emperor's cause, and he personally helped construct the defenses around the Emperor's palace on Terra. He's also one of the Primarchs that seems to hate smiling or appearing happy in any way. The 8th Primarch is Konrad Curze, who's also known as the Night Haunter. He was teleported to a world full of criminals and is one of the only Primarchs that wasn't taken in by a family as a child. He was absolutely brutal if you were fighting against him, and he specialized in using fear tactics. He is also one of the Primarchs that inherited a bit of the Emperor's gift to see into the future, but it's really not great for him. It is very much a curse in his case because he can typically only see into the future in his dreams, and they're almost always terrible, dark, unsettling futures. The 9th Primarch is Sanguinius, who is generally regarded as being one of the most beloved of all Primarchs. He has actual angelic wings attached to his back, and of all the Primarchs, the ability to see into the future is strongest in him. Despite this, he couldn't really control or direct his vision. He kind of got glimpses of the future, just much more than any other Primarch. He was also one of the Primarchs that was most skilled in hand-to-hand combat, which is really saying something, and of all the Primarchs, a lot of people kind of saw him as the best successor to the Emperor. He could also sometimes fly into a sort of rage in the middle of battle called a blood rage, and a nimbus would actually glow around his head, and he would be practically unstoppable. We're going to continue from my last video and keep listing the Primarchs, starting with Primarch number 10, Ferrus Manus. If you know Latin, then his name is basically Iron Hand, and that's because he literally has metal hands. By the way, some of the Primarchs coming up are going to have names that feel really on the nose. You'll see what I mean. On his home planet, he fought this beast made of living metal that was pretty much impervious to all damage. He eventually lured it into lava to defeat it, and when he did, some of its metal grafted onto his hands. It's a substance called necrodermis that is often referred to as sort of like a living or organic metal. And it makes his hands so strong that he can actually forge weapons without fire or a hammer, which is one of the reasons he's also one of the best smiths of all the Primarchs. The 11th Primarch is the other lost Primarch, so now we have Angron, the 12th Primarch, and by the way, he's really angry. His homeworld would host these gladiator games, and he was a gladiator. To make him a better fighter, he was given this implant in his head called the Butcher's Nails, which made him angry constantly. It increased his adrenaline and his aggression levels, and it made him feel good when he was angry. So, he wasn't always capable of thinking things out all the way, but he was one of the absolute best fighters, and he had a way of brute forcing his way through a situation with his berserker rage. The 13th Primarch is Roboute Guilliman, and he is a strategic genius. He was number one when it came to tactics and logistics. He came up with all kinds of theoretical strategies that he was actually able to pull off, and his legion actually became one of the largest legions because he suffered very few losses. He's one of the most well-rounded Primarchs in my opinion because he's just a great all-around warrior, general, and statesman. The 14th Primarch is Mortarion, who grew up on a planet full of poisonous gases. Despite this, he was able to achieve quite a bit on this planet because he had a superhuman resilience that was greater than even a lot of the Primarchs. And it wasn't just the ability to endure toxins, it was this state of mind that he could endure anything that would actually even extend to his legions later on. He preferred to fight by putting endless pressure on his enemy until he wore them down. We're going to keep on listing the Primarchs, starting with Primarch number 15, Magnus the Red. Magnus is possibly the strongest human psyker behind the God Emperor of mankind. He's so strong, in fact, that apparently he actually met the Emperor in the warp while he was still in his gestation capsule, making him the first Primarch to actually meet the Emperor. In fact, when the Emperor finally found him, they actually greeted each other like old friends. You might have noticed that Magnus is missing one of his eyes, and that's because when he was finally reunited with the Space Marine Legion that was based off his own genome, they were going through a terrible series of mutations that they called the Flesh Change. It absolutely terrified the Marines because you never really knew who it was going to happen to, and it drastically reduced the size of his legion. So he went into the warp and gave his eye for the knowledge to stop the flesh change, and it worked, but unknown to him, it was only temporary. And the interesting thing is also that the area where his eye used to be is actually just smooth skin. The 16th Primarch is Horus Lupercal. He was the first Primarch to be found by the Emperor, and for a while it was just the two of them. And this was one of the reasons that Horus was actually the Emperor's favorite son. In fact, he even made him War Master of all the legions. So if the Emperor was ever away or gone for some reason, like if he found another Primarch, Horus would lead in his stead. The really cool thing about Horus is his charisma. He was an amazing diplomat, and he did all that he could to actually prevent fighting from ever even happening in the first place. He had a gift for making two sides that did not see eye to eye somehow get along. He was also fantastic at analyzing people psychologically, so if it actually did come to a fight, he knew how to hit you where it hurt. The 17th Primarch is Lorgar, who, believe it or not, isn't quite as focused on combat as his brothers are. He crashed on a planet that was deeply religious, and became deeply religious himself. Like some of his brothers, he had the ability to see into the future to a limited extent, and was able to kind of see that some mighty, godlike figure would arrive. Eventually the Emperor did arrive, and Lorgar was convinced that his god had finally come. But something that you need to know about the Emperor is that he is absolutely against religion, like, no exceptions. Whenever he conquered somewhere new, they would destroy all of their religious artifacts and churches because he wanted his empire to be one that was purely ruled by logic. And I feel like I can't really blame Lorgar for this one because this guy showed up and said he wasn't a god, but it's like, sure about that? You sure about that's 'cause why? Let's finish going over the Primarchs, starting with the 18th Primarch, Vulkan. Vulkan is kind of incredible and a lot of people's favorite Primarch, and for good reason. First of all, like his father, he's a perpetual, which means he can regenerate from pretty much any wound. In fact, one time he was completely vaporized and then still regenerated. He's also an incredibly talented smith, one of the most talented smiths of all the Primarchs. He's also the largest and strongest of all the Primarchs, and has been known to flip over tanks with his bare hands. Lastly, him and his legion are probably the closest thing we can get to good guys in the Imperium of Man. Even though the Primarchs and Space Marines were fighting for humanity, if a human actually wanted to talk to them, they would absolutely disregard them, because what they're doing is more important. Vulkan and his legion don't see it that way, and that's why they're probably the most empathetic and caring of all the legions. The 19th Primarch is Corvus Corax. His eyes are solid black, and he has a special ability to be completely unnoticed if he wants to be. Even if someone is standing right in front of him and staring at him, if he wills it, they won't see him. So the ability seems to affect people's minds. Corvus was also an excellent tactician. In fact, he was actually able to beat Guilliman 3 times in battle using unconventional tactics. But, after Guilliman was beaten those 3 times, Corvus never won again. As I'm sure you can imagine, his legion specializes in stealth tactics. Now we are at the 20th Primarch, or technically Primarchs. Alpharius Omegon, also known as the Hydra, is actually 2 people that share one soul. So whether or not they're 2 Primarchs or 1 is debatable. One of the brothers is named Alpharius, and one of them is named Omegon. And the reason that they're so strange and confusing is because that is very much their tactic. They are all about misdirection and confusing the enemy. When you're fighting his legion, sometimes you don't even know you're fighting his legion until they suddenly jump out from all around you and just completely decimate you. Other people in the Imperium don't really know much about him, and even we, as the audience, kind of have conflicting information. Some sources say that he's taller than his Space Marines, like all Primarchs, and some say that he's about the same size and that he can actually disguise himself as one of them if he wants to. The Space Marines, also known as the Adeptus Astartes, are the genetically engineered soldiers created by the Emperor of Mankind to fight a crusade across the stars and unite all of humanity under his empire, the Imperium of Man. The creation of a Space Marine starts with a collection of genetic augmentations called a gene seed. The Emperor created the gene seeds from the DNA of his 20 children, and then he grouped the Space Marines into legions based on which gene seed he gave them, so each legion is kind of like the child of their Primarch. And since the alterations that the Emperor made to each of the Primarch's DNA affected how their bodies and minds would develop, the augmentations given to a particular Space Marine will actually make them more physically and mentally like their Primarch too. The legions were designed to operate autonomously, being able to make their own decisions and even create more Space Marines without the Emperor. So the gene seeds were developed with mass production in mind, and each Space Marine actually has 2 glands called progenoid glands that will each produce a new gene seed that will allow them to create 1 new Space Marine. It does take time for these glands to develop though, 5 years for the first one and then another 5 years after that for the second one. And even though these new gene seeds won't be affected by any of the Space Marines' original DNA, there can still be mutations. It can happen by chance or because of Chaos's influence, but either way, all the gene seeds are inspected very carefully to make sure that they haven't been mutated too badly. And some of the legions have gene seeds that are more prone to deterioration or certain flaws than others. For some legions, this just means that some of their augmentations don't work, and for others it means serious physical and psychological issues down the road. For a normal Space Marine, 19 organs are developed from a gene seed that are designed to be implanted into an aspiring Space Marine over time as they mature. A special type of Space Marine called a Primarchs Space Marine was developed later, and they have 3 additional organs, but we'll talk about them later. So, this process typically begins between the ages of 10 and 4 and ends around 16 to 18. But regardless, only the best of the best were chosen, and being chosen was just the beginning. Now that we know what a Space Marine is, let's go over what a Space Marine can do by going over their 19 augmentations. Their augmentations are 19 organs that come from a gene seed. Many of these are developed outside of the body and then implanted, while others are injected and then develop inside of an aspiring Space Marine's body. The first implant is a secondary heart, which, on top of being a backup heart, is also able to pump steroids and adrenaline into their system for an extra burst of energy. The second is the osmedulla, which gives Space Marines incredibly strong bones. A ceramic-based mineral is placed in an aspiring Space Marine's food, where the osmedulla will actually incorporate it into their bones. It also makes their bones much larger, so it's partially responsible for the Space Marine's size. It also fuses an Astartes rib cage into a solid plate of bone that helps protect all their internal organs. The third implant, the biscopia, is responsible for strengthening their muscles and is usually implanted along with the osmedulla because it helps regulate it. Jesus Christ, I'm going to pronounce some of these wrong. The Haemus daemon gives them better blood. It just makes it better at carrying oxygen and nutrients, and it also turns it a brighter shade of red. The fifth organ, the Laraman's organ, is one of the reasons that a Space Marine is so hard to kill. It makes them heal way faster. When a normal person is hurt, platelets in their blood clot and make the bleeding stop. The Laraman cells created by the Laraman organ are like platelets but work way better and can actually cause scar tissue to form in seconds. So in most cases, if a Marine isn't outright killed by some wound, they're probably going to survive it. The sixth organ is the catalepsia node, and it lessens a Space Marine's need for sleep. It enables them to go into a kind of trance where half their brain sleeps while the other is still awake. And apparently, a Marine was actually able to stay awake for 328 hours one time because of this. The seventh organ, the preomnar, sits right above the stomach and neutralizes pretty much any poison or toxin that a Space Marine might ingest. The eighth organ is pretty weird, but the omophagia allows a Space Marine to absorb some of the memories of something that it eats. So for instance, a Space Marine can learn a bit about a world they just found by eating an animal native to that world and experiencing a bit of what they experienced right before they died. Let's continue talking about how a Space Marine is augmented, but really quick I want to go over just how dangerous all these procedures are. Throughout this process, aspiring Space Marines are treated with chemicals and hypnotherapy to make sure that their organs develop properly and that they can use them. And all kinds of factors like genetic compatibility and the legion that you're being inducted into make a big difference in whether or not you're going to be likely to survive this. So if your body or mind gives out under this process, you are either put down or turned into this, a servitor. Your mind and personality are wiped and you basically become a cybernetic drone. And they'll more or less act as servants for the Space Marines. Moving on to organ number 9, we have the multi-lung. It's a third lung that allows a Space Marine to breathe normally in an environment that's low in oxygen. In normal conditions, it acts as a third lung that allows a Space Marine to get as much oxygen as possible. But in toxic conditions, the regular lungs are shut off and only the multi-lung is on and it filters out the toxins. The 10th organ is the oculobe and it allows a Space Marine to see normally in low light conditions. The 11th organ, the Lyman's ear, makes a Space Marine immune to dizziness or motion sickness, and it also allows them to consciously block out sonic attacks or white noise. The 12th organ is the Sasan membrane, and it allows a Space Marine that has been mortally wounded to enter a catatonic state that will hopefully allow them to survive their wounds. Their metabolism comes to a complete standstill, and the only way to bring them out of this state is with very specific procedures. One Space Marine was able to stay in this state for 567 years once. The 13th organ is the melanochrome, and it affects pigment in the skin to protect a Space Marine from radiation and heat. Mutations in this organ are usually why salamanders have very dark skin, and blood angels usually have very pale skin. The 14th organ is the olytic kidney. If there are any toxins or poisons that the Space Marine's other organs can't handle, it activates. It'll clear out any of the poisons, but it leaves the Space Marine unconscious during this process, so it's very dangerous if this happens in the middle of combat. The 15th organ is the neuroglottis, and it allows a Space Marine to biochemically analyze anything by smell or taste. It can be used to tell whether something is toxic or edible, and it can also be used to identify animals or prey and allow a Space Marine to actually track its prey like a canine. Let's finish going over the Space Marine's augmentations, starting with the 16th organ, the mucranoid. The mucranoid allows their skin to secrete a waxy substance if a special chemical is applied to it. The wax sort of seals their skin and protects them from extreme temperatures and vacuums, so if a Space Marine is expected to fight in space, the mucranoid is usually used. Also, if the Space Marine needs to go into suspended animation for some reason, they'll kind of cocoon themselves in enough wax to protect them. The 17th organ is the Becher's gland, and it actually allows a Space Marine to turn their saliva into a blinding and corrosive acid if they want to. The most common use for this is to allow a Space Marine to eat things that are normally very difficult for the body to break down, like cellulose. But apparently this acid is no joke, because if a Space Marine is trapped behind iron bars, for instance, they could chew through the bars in a matter of a couple hours. Now the last two organs are probably the most important organs for any Space Marine. For some legions, their gene seed has deteriorated enough for some of these organs to not work at all anymore, and they can get by. But that cannot be the case for these last two organs, or that legion will probably die out. And that's because, for instance, organ number 18, the progenoid glands, are how a Space Marine makes more Space Marines. As I mentioned in the first video of this series, two of these glands are implanted into a Space Marine, one matures in 5 years, the next matures in 5 years after that, and then you have 2 gene seeds total from that Space Marine. The glands are so valuable that if a Space Marine with unharvested glands falls in battle, the apothecary's job is to use that device on his arm to drill through his armor mid-combat and extract the progenoid gland. The 19th organ is the black carapace, and just like the progenoid gland, without this, a Space Marine is much less powerful. If you've ever seen a Space Marine without armor on, then you've probably noticed that they have these strange metal things attached all over their bodies. That's the black carapace. Those are neural connection points that directly hardwire their central nervous system to their power armor, so it acts as an extension of their body. Anyone can wear power armor. In fact, another faction called the Sisters of Battle regularly do. But for them, they are bulky suits of armor that are kind of hard to move in. But every move a Space Marine makes is sent to their power armor through their black carapace, and it moves as an extension of their body, as if they're not wearing any armor at all. In fact, because of this, power armor actually makes them stronger and faster than if they weren't wearing it. Before we start going over the Space Marine legions, let's go over some of the Space Marine's standard war gear. Let's start with armor, and when it comes to power armor, we could go into a lot of detail. And maybe we will in another video, but this video is going to be more about the differences between the common types of power armor during the Great Crusade. The earliest type of power armor, the Mark I armor, was actually worn by the Thunder Warriors, and the next two Marks, Mark II and III, were not that great, honestly. So one of the most common types of armor during the Great Crusade was the Mark IV Maximus armor. Before this, power armor was generally bulky, noisy, and difficult to use. This armor was lighter and easier to manufacture, and at the time it was even envisioned to be the ultimate power armor for a Space Marine. For that reason, this armor was rapidly distributed throughout all the legions, and some of it actually still survives 10,000 years later in the 41st millennium. Mark V power armor wasn't widely distributed, but Mark VI, which is above me, was, and it can be identified from its beaks. The Mark VI is appropriately named the Corvus armor, and the main reason I wanted to show you this armor is because if I show you a picture of a Space Marine with a beak, I feel like you're going to have questions. Now we get to the big boys, Terminator armor. This is the Cataphractii pattern Terminator armor that was most common during the Great Crusade. Terminator armor is absolutely massive, and a Space Marine that uses it is basically turned into a walking tank. The Emperor's original idea was that eventually all Space Marines would be wearing Terminator armor. But so much time and resources are required to make just one suit of armor that it became a very unrealistic plan. And besides that, Terminator armor is really bulky and hard to move in, even with the Space Marine's black carapace. And a Space Marine has to go through a pretty rigorous training process just to know how to fight in Terminator armor. So in certain situations, Terminator armor is actually less effective than regular armor because it can be outmaneuvered pretty easily. So Terminator armor is mostly used in close-range combat, like on-board ships, for instance. But it should be noted that a lot of Terminator armor also has built-in teleporters, so they can very quickly make a fight close range if they want. Now that we've gone over Space Marine armor, let's go over the weapons that the Space Marines use. And if we're going to talk about Space Marine weapons, then you need to know about the bolter, also known as the bolt gun. It is the signature weapon of the Adeptus Astartes and regarded as one of the finest weapons in all of the Imperium of Man. There are other factions like the Sisters of Battle that use bolters, but their bolters have been modified so that they're actually usable by a human. The gun is so heavy and large that a human would probably struggle to hold it, and if they managed to fire it, then the recoil would probably take their arm off. So even if you don't know a lot about guns, if you've played many video games about them, then you know that a 50 caliber gun is very powerful. The ammunition used by bolters, also called bolts, are 75 caliber. Bolts are also rocket-propelled and explosive, and the bolter can fire them in up to 4-round bursts. There are variants of bolters that are weaker and lighter, like a bolter gun, and stronger, like a storm bolter typically only used by Terminator Space Marines. The Space Marines and other forces of the Imperium also had access to plasma guns. During the Great Crusade, plasma weapon technology was not really well developed yet, and these guns were actually pretty dangerous for the users. Repeated firing would cause heat to build up in the weapon, and it could eventually explode. The user could vent the heat to try to avoid this, but the weapons were known to be pretty temperamental, and they could sometimes still explode just from manufacturing issues. The plasma guns are no joke. They're also called sun guns because suns are made of plasma, if you didn't know, and these things can punch right through armor like it's nothing. So even though the gun was dangerous, it was so powerful that it couldn't be ignored, and it was used, although sparingly, typically being used by officers rather than common soldiers. Next, we have a common melee weapon used by Space Marines, the chainsword. I wish that there was more I could say about it, but it's a sword that's also a chainsaw. Sometimes you can judge a book by its cover. The Space Marines were also known to use power swords, which use a disruptive energy field to cut through anything with relative ease. We're talking armor, bone, whatever. The Power Fist, which is usually only used by Terminator armor because of how large it is similar to the Power Sword. It emits an energy field that disrupts matter at a molecular level and allows them to punch through pretty much anything pretty easily. And then there's the Lightning Claw, which is essentially a Power Fist with 4 mini Power Swords attached to it.